All right, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and today's text extends from verse 2 to verse number 16. So I'm going to read the text, invite you to follow along as I read. When I finish verse 16, I'll say, "This is the word of the Lord," and you can respond, "Thanks be to God." Would you follow along as I read, please? 1 Corinthians 11, beginning in verse 2. "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is a shame, as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but a woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless," how are you doing so far? Yeah, okay. Verse 11, "Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some of you are wondering, I'm giving thanks, but I'm not sure what it means. And we're going to work on that together. Let's pray and then dive into this text. Lord, we want to acknowledge that your word is truth. We want to acknowledge that it's a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. We want to acknowledge that it feeds our soul. Man cannot live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from your mouth. And so while we acknowledge those things, we also confess our inabilities. So we confess that some of the passages that you write about, like Peter says, they're hard to understand. And so help us this morning as we seek the sense of your word. Help us this morning then as we're challenged by your word to be people who submit to the scriptures. Lord, I know in my own experience, and I imagine it to be true of all who are here this morning, that the only way we are going to be dislodged from firmly held beliefs, the only way we're going to be dislodged from them is if your word, by your Spirit, does the change. So change us to have the mind of Christ. Change us to embrace your word. Change us to have the obedience of faith. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. From the outset, I'm just going to say this. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16 is a rather challenging passage. I mean, even reading it is a little challenging. But the concepts behind it are also challenging. And I'm going to talk about why that's the case, and then I'm going to seek to kind of walk us through the text together this morning. But I want to just encourage you just to put on your thinking caps. I'm going to have to teach you some things about the culture and about this text to bring us through it, all right? I want to start this way. I want to start by asking you to think about the law of oughtness. Are you familiar with the law of oughtness? It's a way of describing the unspoken shoulds in life. The unwritten oughts of our existence. We all operate with them. We have expectations and assumptions that make up our law of oughtness. I'm going to give you a few entries in the law of oughtness that I think almost all of us can innately affirm. For instance, you ought to brush your teeth at least once a day. Right? Some of you are like, no, I like to have fur grow on the front teeth. No, that's gross, man. You ought to brush your teeth at least once a day. All right, here's another one. You shouldn't run with scissors pointed up. Or scissors pointed down. Just don't run with scissors, right? I mean, but there's a pretty standard law of oughtness there. You ought to turn on the fan when you use the restroom. I'm not going to look up at any nudges right now. Don't do that. You shouldn't smoke next to open barrels of jet fuel. Right? It's kind of these are laws of oughtness. And they swirl around through our everyday experiences. We assume certain things. We think, well, everybody knows that. But then all of a sudden, we encounter a passage like 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul gives us a few entry codes from the law of oughtness. He says, you ought to do this, or you ought to do that. And suddenly we're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Did you catch those in the text? Verse number 7. A man ought not to cover his head. Law of oughtness. Verse number 10. A wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. Law of oughtness. Verse number 13, he talks about something being proper, assuming that everybody universally understands this and univocally accepts it. It's proper, of course. Everybody ought to. You should do this. Now, back in first century Corinth, these shoulds and oughts of head covering and hair length, these kind of things made sense. But here we are with a cultural distance of nearly 2 millennia, and these things no longer are self-evident. And so when we read a text like this, some of us are left thinking, well, what is this about? We're supposed to glean something from these antiquated instructions about head covering or not covering your head? What is going on here? So I think what I'd like to do to get us to really appreciate this text is I want to help you understand the larger context. Where does 1 Corinthians 11 fall in the larger context? Then I want to talk you through some historical components, some socio-cultural issues that you really need to grasp from first century Corinth if you're going to understand and apply this text. And then I'll walk you through Paul's argument in the text itself. Okay? So let's just start with the larger context. 1 Corinthians 11 is part of a section, it's a new section, where he extends from chapter 11 all the way through chapter 14. And in that section from chapter 11 to 14, he's talking all about how Christians are supposed to behave in the corporate gathering of the church. So when believers assemble, when they gather together, this is how believers are supposed to behave. And he starts in chapter 11, our text today, by talking about when you assemble for worship, your adornment should be like this. So he's going to talk to us about how to behave, specifically concerning our adornment in the first part of chapter 11. Then he's going to move on and talk to Christians about how they should behave when they celebrate the Lord's table. So in the gathered company of the church, when the congregation assembles and you celebrate communion, this is how you're supposed to treat the poor. This is how you're supposed to behave. And then he's going to talk about spiritual gifts. When the church gathers, this is how you're supposed to use your spiritual gifts. And that's chapter 12, 13, and 14. So he's got this extensive section, 11 through 14, to instruct believers about how to behave in the church, starting with our text today, which is about adornment when the congregation gathers for worship. Now, when we talk about adornment, if you were following along as I worked my way through the text and read it aloud, you realize that he's talking about something with head coverings, or not having your head covered. He's talking about something with hair length, having short hair or shaved hair or long hair, something going on there. So he's talking about your adornment in the congregation when the church gathers together. But I want to suggest to you from the very beginning that whether or not you wear a doily on your head is not the primary issue of this text. In other words, now I want to say this. There are some congregations that actually seek to follow this text very literally. Some good congregations, some faithful believers. And their application of this text would be to utilize head coverings for women. I was actually last month up in Alaska. I observed a congregation that utilized head coverings. So the women had these like shawls that went over their heads. I know of other congregations, actually faithful pastors, good congregations that would follow it very literally, and they would ask women to cover their head. One author I was reading while I was studying was a female author, and she went to a church and didn't have a head covering, and she noticed there was someone that, because they didn't have one, they put a plastic bowl on their head. I thought, well, I don't know if that's the spirit of the text, all right? You get a plastic mixing bowl from the cafe out there and stick it on your head. That would probably be the opposite of what this text is trying to tell us to do, right? So, right up front, he's talking about head coverings, no head coverings, length of hair, but the doily's not the issue. Here's what's the issue, and I want you to catch this from the very beginning because it drives this whole text. Underneath his discussion of doilies or no doilies, long hair or short hair, underneath this discussion, Paul is primarily concerned that believers reflect proper distinctions between men and women. He's actually very concerned about gender distinction in the congregation, and he's also concerned that marital roles are being played out in a way that pleases God when the church gathers. Gender distinction, marital roles, and Christ-focused worship. Not focus on self, but focus on Christ. That's what he's really concerned about. So in all this talk about doilies, all this talk about hair length, actually he cares about gender distinction, roles and responsibilities in marriage, and directing your attention towards Jesus in the gathered congregation of the church. Now, to help us understand that from the text, there are a few historical cultural points that I want to get across, okay? I want to talk to you about the Greco-Roman context of the first century that will help this passage make sense to us. So here's the first thing you need to know about that era. Number one, during pagan religious ceremonies, priests would pull togas up over their heads. Pagan priests in pagan temples would wear togas, and when they were going to offer a sacrifice or say a prayer, these pagan priests would pull the toga up over and they would cover their heads. That happened in first century Corinth. They weren't the only ones, however, the only men that covered their heads. Roman men with high social status also covered their heads. So if you were part of the elite, if you had power, wealth, and influence in Roman Corinth during the first century, then you would have had a toga and you would have shown your influence or your elite status by pulling it up over your head. And it's because it identified you with Augustus. Augustus did this. He actually, and you can see these, he had sculptures made of himself, and in these sculptures that he set throughout the empire, he has a toga pulled up over his head. You could see these sculptures from that era. They have some extant ones. I was looking at one this last week. So if you were part of the elite, if you were powerful and influential or wealthy, you were a man, you would wear a toga, and to show it off, to indicate to everybody else, I'm at the top echelon of life, you pull that toga up over and cover your head. Pagan priests, socially elite men, put togas over their head. They wore head coverings. That's the first historical fact you need to know. Here's the second one. A woman's head covering in the first century Corinth socially indicated that she was married. Now, we have a social custom in our day, in our place, that indicates that someone's married. What is that? You wear a wedding ring. Well, for them, what they would do is a married woman would cover her head with a thin headscarf, and it would symbolize her modesty, chastity, and fidelity. That's what she would do. If a wife refused to cover her head when she was out and about in public, she would actually disgrace her husband. It was women who were prostitutes that would uncover their head and let their hair hang down in first century Roman Corinth. The third thing you need to know. There was a new kind of wife emerging in the Roman world during the first century. This new type of wife rebelled against the cultural norms that had allowed her husband to be sexually promiscuous, but not allowed her to be that. So in first century Roman Corinth, men were often sexually promiscuous. They had concubines and they went and saw prostitutes. They would have dinner parties and they would have people, these escorts who would come in. That was widely known among men, but women were not allowed that. And so there was this kind of new emerging kind of rebel against cultural norms wife that was emerging at this time. And one way that she would flaunt her own sexual freedom, one way that she would communicate that she was available, was to take off her head covering in public. She aligned herself with the banquet women who would offer sexual casual favors for elite men as a means of upward mobility. And so there were some women in first century Roman culture who were taking that off to express their sexual liberation and tell people they were available to have a side hustle. It would be like, I don't know, not all these analogies work perfectly, but it might be like someone who's going to go out on Friday night and they take off their ring because they don't want anyone to know that they're married so that they can be a little more available. Well, that was going on in the first century, and the way that they did that is these wives would take off their head covering. Okay. Number 4. There was another circumstance in which women would take off their head covering. It was in their private residence. So if they were in their own home, they had guests come over, it was totally acceptable for them to take off their head covering. And actually, women of high social status often did this. And here's why. Because they would display their hairstyle, their braided hair, their hairstyle, and they would display their jewelry. So if you were having some sort of a dinner party, you invite a bunch of people over to your house, then what some women would do is they would want to flaunt their wealth and status by taking off their head covering, showing their hairdo, and all of their jewelry. Now, other women in that house, in a private residence, could also take off their head covering, but only if they were of equal social status. So this is important. You have to kind of understand this. Only people of equal social status could take off their head covering, the women could, when they were in a private home. They say, Lukas, why do I have to understand this? Because do you remember where churches first met? Okay, synagogues, Paul would often preach in synagogues, but where did the first churches start? They didn't have cathedrals. In homes. They met in people's homes. So can you imagine what would go on if here's the wealthiest person of this Christian community who probably has the biggest house, and they open up their house to all these Christians to come over to their home. And here's this woman, and she's the matron of that house, and she's very wealthy, and she decides she's going to take off her head covering because she wants to show what kind of salon she went to and show off all of her jewelry. And only the women who are of the same social status could do the same, and it divided those women immediately. Do you see what it did? All of a sudden, social status just caused a division in the church. This was a pretty significant thing. Haven't you ever wondered about passages like 1 Timothy 2:9? Women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. I wonder what that verse is all about. It's probably about this very issue. Or how about 1 Peter 3:3-4? Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of the hair, the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Here's the last historical point I think you need to know. Hair length had communicative power in first century Corinth. In other words, it sent a message. The length of your hair was significant for women. Enslaved women, slaves, had their hair cut. And so did, according to Roman law, so did adulterous women. So according to Roman law, if a woman was caught in adultery, her head got shaved. So slaves and adulterous women were shamed by their hair being cut off. On the other hand, adult men in Corinth did not wear long hair because it indicated a denial of their masculinity. There are extant sculptures of Phrygian captives from late 2nd century Corinth. They're depicted as weak and effeminate with long hair. Additionally, there's a 1st century work known as Pseudo-Fossilides. That's the name of this writing from the 1st century, and this is what it says, quote, "If a child is a boy, do not let locks grow on his head. Do not braid his crown or cross knots at the top of his head. Long hair is not fit for boys, but for voluptuous women." That's what he wrote. It's not fit for boys. Long hair, no, that's not for them. It was widely known in Corinth during the 1st century that your hair length communicated something. So these historical cultural points, I think, are going to help us as we seek to interpret this text. Okay, let's go back to the driving point of the passage. What is the passage about? Remember I said, it's not really about doilies. That's not what it's about. Actually, underneath this whole discussion, Paul wants us to understand that Christians need to reflect gender distinctions, they need to fulfill their marital roles, and they need to direct attention towards Christ in the gathering of the church. Now, here's what the text does. It gives us reasons why we should do that. So Paul kind of argues, why is that the case? Why is it the case that the actions and the behaviors of the gathered church should embrace gender distinction, should really fulfill God's plan for marital roles, and should direct one's attention towards Christ and Christ alone? Why is that the case? The first thing he says is because of the complementary nature of the Trinity. He appeals to a theological truth. And that is the reason why in the gathered assembly, men and women need to fulfill their marital roles is because of the Trinity. And you're like, because of the Trinity? Yeah, in verse number 3, Paul makes a point that the husband-wife relationship should reflect the father-son relationship in terms of honor, submission, and authority. Concerning the gathered church, this is what Paul says, verse 3. I want you to understand, the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, the whole text turns on this word head, because you have the head of man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, the head of Christ is God. Okay, what does this mean when he says the head? He's talking about, it signifies authority and honor. And I think we can understand if we think in terms of like a headmaster at a school has authority, or the head of parliament has authority in government, or the head of a household receives either honor or shame, depending on the actions and behaviors of that household. So we should get this idea, when we see this word head or headship, we should get this idea of authority and honor. Paul teases out how the son honors the father and submits to his will. And by analogy, the husband honors Christ and submits to his will, and the wife honors her husband and submits to him in the assembly of believers. You see that in verse number 3. Now, first century husbands would demonstrate their submission to Christ and their desire to honor him by uncovering their heads. So again, remember our text. He's talking about men, you shouldn't have your head covered. Why? Because if men covered their heads, they were not honoring their head, namely Christ. Why were they not honoring Christ when they covered their head? Because when they took their toga, went like this and covered their head, they were identifying either with pagan priests, that doesn't honor Christ, or with the socially elite and calling everyone to notice whom? Themselves. You see, in the gathered church, if you puff your chest up and you want everyone to know everything about you, and you're the greatest and you're the awesomest and you're the best, then you are distracting people from Jesus. And that's why he says, husbands, you need to submit to Christ, your head. You need to honor him, and therefore do not cover your head. Are you tracking? In like manner, he's using this analogy of honor, authority, submission. In like manner, he says, wives, you need to cover your head because you don't want to be identified as someone who's sexually promiscuous. You come into the church and you're going to dress in a culturally immodest way. Then what you're going to do is you're going to draw attention to yourself instead of attention to whom? To Christ. You're also going to erode the fidelity and modesty that you're supposed to show in marriage. And so the wife was supposed to keep her head covered because it communicated marital fidelity and modesty and chastity. And it kept people from looking at her, and instead they could focus on Christ. Now, this is significant because I think when we understand it this way, this analogous relationship that Paul is trying to draw out, maybe it takes some of the sting out of this word submission. First, for all the women in here, I just want you to know, notice that the text says that the husband has to submit. To whom? His head, namely Christ. I think sometimes there's only like preaching about the wives need to submit, and actually this text is beautiful because it says, ladies, have no fear. These men need to submit to Christ. He's their head. Now, the other thing it does is it shows us that Christ himself submitted. Isn't that beautiful in this text? It takes the sting out of this word that our culture says, no, 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 no. It takes the sting out because actually Jesus submitted to the Father. This whole respect and submission piece does not have to be a bitter pill to swallow because the relationship between a husband and a wife is modeled after the pattern of the relationship of the Father to the Son. What I love about this analogy that Paul brings out in verse 3 is that the Father and the Son have essential equality, and yet there's voluntary submission. In essence, the Father and the Son, in terms of divinity, are co-equal. And yet, in terms of function, they are different. And so with a husband and wife, ontological equality, but essential distinction in function. What does that indicate? It indicates that submission is neither demeaning nor dangerous. I love what Kathy Keller, this is Tim Keller's wife, Kathy. She says, and I'm just going to tell you, if you read any of her writings, she's a very smart lady who wrestled with this subject. And this is what she finally came to. She said this, if it is not an assault on the dignity and divinity of the second person of the Godhead to submit himself and assume the role of servant, then how could it possibly injure me to be asked to play out the Jesus role? What Paul appeals to here is he says, in the church, believers, you need to fulfill your marital roles. You need to do that. And it's based on the complementary nature of the Trinity. Have you ever thought about the fact, to the married folk in this room, have you ever thought about the fact that your disruptive marriage, your dysfunctional relationship could actually distract the church from worshiping Christ? You say, I don't know how that could happen. Well, let me just take you to a car ride where a mom and a dad are fighting their whole way to church. And then let me just ask you about how the kids are doing in that service. You just distracted some of the church from the worship of Jesus because you didn't properly fulfill your roles. What about when there's like this fracture that's happening in a marriage and there's sides that are being chosen in the church and people's making friendship decisions about who they're going to go with, and then all of a sudden the church is caught up in this marital dilemma and they're not focused on Jesus. Do you see how marital roles being fulfilled in the church is actually important? That's what Paul is saying. Fulfill your marital roles because actually it's rooted in the complementary nature of the Trinity. I think he goes on in this discussion, and his second line of argument is not just the complementary nature of the Trinity, but we need to reflect gender distinction, fulfill marital roles, and direct our attention to Jesus because, number two, because of the culture in which we live. So he appeals to the culture. What he says to believers is that we need to uphold order and propriety in the gathered assembly because of common cultural perceptions and practices. And you see this in verse number 5 when he begins to talk about things that are dishonorable or things that are disgraceful. He's really talking about in the culture. Like, Corinthian church, don't you realize in our culture that when you do these things, it's like, it's a disgrace. It's culturally inappropriate. You're bringing dishonor. I mean, outsiders are looking in on this, and it's just dishonorable. In verse number 5, he says this. Let me back up to verse number 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. In other words, it would be culturally dishonorable and disgraceful to continue practicing some of the things that were going on in the church of Corinth. Let me explain what I mean. There was a cultural norm. There was just a cultural practice that women of propriety, modesty, chastity, fidelity, that women like that would cover their heads. The unbelievers did it. That was just a sign of fidelity, modesty, and chastity. And he's saying this, you believers should not be the one tearing down those virtuous cultural norms. If that's a cultural norm that points to something that's good and honorable, why in the world would the Christian church be the one tearing it down? That's disgraceful. That's dishonorable. We shouldn't be the ones needlessly breaking with cultural conventions that actually point to virtues. Instead, what you had at the church of Corinth is these women were pulling off their head covering, and they were communicating rebellion, disrespect, and promiscuity. And he says, that's not what you should be doing. That's dishonorable. That's culturally shameful. In an honor-shame society, they were doing things that were contrary to the values that Scripture upholds. You see in verses 13 through 15, Paul's going to argue that the proper, the common, the regular, natural, normal way things are is that a wife would cover her head and a man would not. And additionally, that it would be appropriate for a woman to have long hair, but a man to have short hair in their cultural setting. Because it actually, in their cultural paradigm, it communicated gender distinction. So when you get to verses 13 through 15, take a look at the text. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself, doesn't the norms of culture, nature, when you see that, doesn't the common expectation of society, the norms of culture, doesn't that teach us that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? In other words, in Paul's first century Corinthian culture, it was the common expectation in society that one of the ways that you would distinguish men from women had to do with the length of their hair. And Paul is simply saying this, Christians should not be the ones blurring gender distinctions. Christians shouldn't be doing that. God created these two distinct and purposefully, and Christians shouldn't be the ones who are blurring that. In our culture, men don't normally wear dresses or carry purses or use cosmetics. And what that would mean is that the church probably shouldn't be the one breaking the cultural norms that distinguish genders in those ways. On the flip side, women should probably not bind their breasts, wear men's clothing, try to get masculine haircuts, because that would be blurring the gender distinctions that God has set in place and are recognized by our culture. Now, I realize, folks, just hear me say this. I realize that what is appropriate for masculinity and femininity in various times and cultures has some change to it. Now, I was trying to study some other cultures, like in our culture, we wear a wedding ring to show that we are married and to picture fidelity to our spouse. In other cultures, there's a South Sudanese tribe, and what they did is the women who were married wore aprons. So if you had an apron on, you were a married woman, and that's how you were going to signify fidelity in marriage. Or there was another culture I read about. The women who were married, they would actually braid their hair in a particular way. And having all these little braids signify that they were married. And that would show fidelity in their marriage. Or Amish men, what did they do? Once they're married, they grow the beard, right? I mean, there's different cultures and different times had different ways of distinguishing things. In the first century, the length of hair had something to do with identifying men and women. And I think what Paul is getting across is that Christians shouldn't be blurring that distinction. I think what Paul is most concerned about is that your heart is submitted to God and reflected in ways where you abide by cultural gender distinctions. Paul's talking about head covering and hair lengths here. But I think what's important for us is to wrestle with, well, what does that mean in our culture and in our time, in our society? And does our heart submit to those things? Paul wants believers to reflect gender distinction, fulfill marital roles, direct their attention to Christ in the gathered company of the church. And he argues this from the complementary nature of the Trinity, from the culture in which we live. And his third line of argument is this: from creational design. Go all the way back to creation and realize that this is what God wants. In verses 7 through 9, Paul looks back to creation. He shows how men and women are not interchangeable. You can't blur the distinction and turn men and women into these unisex beings where you can switch and swap. It doesn't work that way. That's not how God designed things. That's not how he created humanity. The text points out in verses 7 through 9 how God made woman from the man, not vice versa. How he created woman for the man, not vice versa. If you think back to the creation story, you're thinking about Adam. What happened? God takes the rib, forms Eve. Why did he form Eve? Because man, it was not good that man would be alone. And so he says the woman was made from the man and for the man. These differences are supposed to be reflected in the way men seek to honor the Lord and the way women seek to honor the Lord. He says in verse number 7, kind of an interesting little turn of words here. He says, man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Now that has been turned in a million different ways if you read different articles and different people on this text. Man is the glory of God, woman is the glory of man. I can say this, Paul is not saying that men are superior. Instead, he's saying that each gender has a distinct responsibility in the larger plan of God's glory. Let me see if I can illustrate this. In my yard, I have 5 fruit trees, one of which is an apple tree. And this year, the apple tree does not always produce every year. But this year, my apple tree has tons of apples. I mean, there are so many apples, the branches are like hanging way low. Now, they're not ripe yet. I have seen some people walk by my house and steal some off of my apple tree only to find out they're not done yet, guys. They're not done yet. All right, so they're not ripe yet. But I have a deep hope. And that is, I've got an apple tree, and this apple tree has apples. And in a matter of weeks or maybe a month, I am going to enjoy an apple pie. I mean, it's going to be amazing. I can't wait. Apple tree, apples, apple pie. Now, the apple pie is the glory of those apples. I mean, it just accentuates the goodness of those apples. Sure, you could just eat a raw apple, but an apple pie, it's the glory of those apples. And to work our way backwards, I'd say this: the apples are the glory of that tree. In other words, the way you know that that tree is good, that it bears good fruit and it's not blighted, are these beautiful apples. So the apple pie is the glory of the apples, and the apple is the glory of the apple tree. And we're not saying that one is somehow better than the other. We're saying that they work in a complementary way for a grander scheme of glory. And in like manner, men and women are different yet complementary, working in a grander scheme to bring God glory. As one author put it, men and women are like opposites to one another. They're like two pieces of a puzzle that fit together because they're not exactly alike, nor are they randomly different. They're differentiated and yet complementary, such that together they complete the whole and bring God glory together. And so what Paul's doing is he's going back to creational design, and he's saying men and women are not interchangeable, they're distinct, but they are interdependent. So they're not interchangeable, but they are interdependent, and you see that in verses 11 and 12. And this is important. Take a look at our text, verse 11 and 12. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of a man, nor man of woman. And that's why I'm saying they're interdependent. They're not independent, they're interdependent. Verse 12, for as the woman was made from man, so now man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. What he's saying here is, lest we mistakenly think of Paul as some kind of a chauvinist suffering from toxic masculinity, we have to see that he's actually elevating the status of women. He's showing men and women are interdependent. They need one another for life and flourishing. Yes, the first woman came from man, right? Eve was formed from Adam's rib, but he says, but every man after that came from woman. And so he's elevating the status of women. I mean, Paul's not ostracizing them or somehow subjugating them. Instead, he's showing how they have a vibrant role in the church. I mean, in verse number 5, the women are actively praying and prophesying. In contrast to Jewish synagogues where women were not considered full members, where women had to sit behind a veil, in the Christian church, women are involved in the worship. And while men and women are not interchangeable, they are interdependent. And Paul is saying that's all part of God's creational design. Okay, remember his point here. Here's his point. In the gathering of God's people, we need to reflect gender distinction, fulfill marital roles, and direct our attention to Christ. And we know that because of the complementary nature of the Trinity, the culture in which we live, we just look out there, and creational design. Now there's one last line of argument he uses, and it's this. Because of the practice of the church at large. Verse number 16, Paul will appeal to the church at large. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. He weighs into this argument by reflecting on what we would call orthopraxy. Now, maybe you've never heard of that word. You've probably heard of orthodoxy. That's like generally held beliefs. Orthopraxy is generally practiced traditions. And Paul is saying, if you look at the generally practiced traditions of the church at large, you will find, Corinth, that you are out of step. What you guys are doing is not orthopraxy. This is not the generally practiced traditions of the church of Christ. No, you guys are out of line. You're out of sync. And so Paul tries to pull them back. You need to reflect gender distinction, fulfill your marital roles, direct your attention to Christ, just like all the churches of God do. He appeals to orthopraxy. And then he highlights, think about this, the gathering of church. He's like, listen, this is how all the churches behave. But you also need to know this is important because there are onlookers. It's interesting in this text, he just kind of throws in this little angel thing. It's like a grenade, He's like, oh, and angels are watching, and he walks away. And you're like, what? Because most of us came to church this morning, and we may have thought, like, someone else is going to see me. I better make sure my hair is straight. You did your once a day brush your teeth. I know. Okay, you did it. Congrats. But maybe you didn't think about the fact that angels were watching. There are onlookers. Verse number 10, a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. What Paul is noting here is that the elect angels of God look in on the practices of Christian worship. And I think it might even be interesting. There's one scholar I read, I thought this was fascinating to consider. Why does he talk about angels in this whole discussion of head covering? And it might be linked to Isaiah chapter 6, verse 2. Do you remember the angels, seraphim, who are hovering about the throne of God saying, holy, 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 holy? Do you remember them? They have 6 wings. And with 2, they cover their face. With 2, they cover their feet. And with 2, they fly. And I wonder if there's a link here. Even the angels have some covering to show decorum and propriety. And they're looking in. Now, I don't know if that's the link or not. but Paul is telling us, and he does this in a number of other places. He just kind of drops this, oh, and the angels are watching, by the way. You see it in passages like Ephesians 3:10. You see it in 1 Timothy 5:21. Peter actually mentions it in 1 Peter 1:12. In all of this, these angels are watching in. And so he says, listen, for the sake of orthopraxy, the traditional practices of the broader church, for the sake of orthopraxy, for the sake of onlookers, angels, reflect God's plan for gender distinction, marriage roles, and focused worship. Now, I've tried to surface Paul's arguments along the way in this text. He's appealed to the complementary nature of the Trinity, the norms of culture, creational design, the church practice at large. I think all of these offer great reasons for us as a church body to reflect gender distinctions, for marriages to really uphold their God-given roles, and for us to focus our worship. But I want to close by just reminding you what's at stake here. And I think what's at stake here is this idea of focused worship, this centrality of Christ. Paul is driving at this stuff about doilies or no doilies, right? Togas or no togas, and long hair or short hair. But again, remember, he wants the church to gather and focus on Jesus. And you realize that if men were coming in and pulling up their togas, they were promoting themselves instead of Christ. If women were coming in and taking off their head covering and just disbanding this whole idea of fidelity and modesty, then they would be drawing attention to themselves and not to Christ. And what this would do is it would distract worshipers from Jesus. So what's at stake here is Christ-centered worshipers. Because if we don't follow these things, if we blur gender distinctions, if we disregard our marital roles, if we don't really work at focusing our worship, then we will be distracted in our gatherings. And not only that, we will suffer disunity. The last implication here is this. If these wealthy men of high social status began to don their togas, or if these rich women wanted to show off their wealth, what you're going to get is you're going to get a fracture in the church between the haves and the have-nots, between the wealthy and the poor. And if you think I'm making this up, just keep reading chapter 11. Because we're going to get to the Lord's Supper the next time we talk, and he is going to rebuke the church of Corinth because they are neglecting and ostracizing the poor. Probably this was going on. Not only were people distracted from Christ-centered worship, but there was disunity in the church because they weren't upholding these things. What do we need to do? Well, my friends, we need to promote the unity of the church and the exaltation of Christ when we gather and worship. And Paul says in this text, the way we can do that is by embracing appropriate expressions of gender distinction, modesty, sexual purity, by modeling authority and submission in our marital roles, and by getting our focus back on Christ. May God be glorified in our church.